He hid in the taiga for 10 years, and only the wolf knew who he really was. Who was he really? A man who had been presumed dead for 10 years? A ghost from the past whose name was cursed? Or a savior who emerged from the heart of the taiga? This story began where roads and human laws end. It began with a scream. The Kamenka River did not forgive mistakes. A powerful current threw the inflatable raft onto sharp rocks hidden under the water. The rubber burst with a deafening bang. The icy water immediately closed over the heads of the 4 tourists. Lena Petrova surfaced first, desperately gasping for air. She saw her boyfriend, Kostya. His leg was stuck between a piece of the raft and the sharp edge of an underwater boulder. Kostya screamed. It was not a cry of fear. It was a cry of unbearable pain. A few kilometers from that place, in the thicket, a man raised his head. His name was Sergei. Or rather, that was his name in his previous life. Now he had no name. His weather-beaten, stern face expressed nothing. But his eyes, deep and attentive, were frozen. Next to him, on a fallen cedar tree, a large lynx rose silently. Its tufted ears twitched nervously. The beast looked at the man. The man looked at the beast. Asha, as he called her, was the only living creature that had seen him every day for 10 years, and only she knew who he was. The cry repeated, and Sergei slowly moved toward it, not out of curiosity, not out of pity, but because that sound awakened something in him that he had tried to bury within himself for a decade. Before we continue, let us know what city you are from. We are interested in knowing where our videos are being watched. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave your rating. This motivates us to make new and interesting videos. Well, let's get started. Lena and the second guy, Andrei, managed with great difficulty to pull Kostya ashore. It was a terrible sight. The trouser leg on his right leg was torn to shreds. A white piece of bone was sticking out of the torn wound just below the knee. Blood was soaking the fabric and the ground around it. Kostya was pale and almost unconscious. Andrei, the leader of their group, tried to do something. He washed the wound with water from a canteen and tried to apply a tourniquet, but the blood continued to flow. They were trapped. The radio was broken. The satellite phone had drowned along with the backpack. The nearest shelter was a week's walk away. Sergei watched them from behind a thick wall of bushes. He saw everything: unprofessional actions, growing panic, and the wound. He could see it as clearly as if he were looking through a surgical microscope. An open, comminuted fracture of the tibia, damage to an artery. He could see dirt, pieces of bark, and river mud in the wound, and he knew what would happen next. Infection, sepsis, gangrene, death. It was only a matter of time. 2, maybe 3 days. He had to leave, turn around and disappear, as he had done hundreds of times before when he heard the sound of a helicopter or saw the smoke from someone else's campfire. That was the main rule of his new life. Leave no trace. Make no contact. Be a shadow. But his legs seemed to be rooted to the ground, his hands clenched into fists of their own accord. He didn't just see a wounded tourist, he saw a patient. His patient. Asya snorted quietly beside him, as if asking what they were doing there. Sergei put his hand on her neck, and she calmed down. He continued to watch as dusk gathered over the forest and the small, doomed camp. At the same time, in a city penthouse bathed in light, Yegor Belsky looked at the man sitting across from him. The man looked tired and worn out. His name was Igor Matveyevich Sokolov. 10 years ago, he was the investigator who had handled the case of the death of Surgeon Orlov. Now he was a private detective. Yegor tapped his fingers impatiently on the black wooden table. "So you're saying the case is closed? But there are some nuances? His voice was cold and cutting. Igor Matveyevich nodded slowly. Sergei Orlov's body was never found. The official version is that he drowned and his body was carried away by the current. But I never believed that. Orlov wasn't the type to take his own life. He was a fighter. Yegor smiled. A fighter who killed my father on the operating table and was afraid of the consequences. Perhaps. The detective did not argue. But I looked through his accounts and internet searches before he disappeared. He was interested in Old Believer skeets and abandoned geological bases. Right in this area. He wasn't preparing for death. He was preparing to escape. Yegor Belsky's eyes narrowed. For 10 years, he had lived with the belief that his father's killer was dead. And now this old wound had been reopened. Find him, he ordered. I don't care how much it costs. Find me this Taiga surgeon, alive. He emphasized the last word. Igor Matveyevich understood that for his client, this was not a matter of justice. It was a matter of revenge. The night in the Taiga brought cold. The fire barely dispelled the darkness. Kostya began to burn with fever. He raved, tossed and turned, and moaned. Lena sat nearby, wetting his forehead with a wet rag. She felt completely helpless. Andrei slept by the fire, exhausted and depressed. Suddenly, a figure stepped out of the darkness. Lena screamed. Andrei jumped to his feet, grabbing his hatchet. Standing before them was a man. Tall, thin, dressed in homemade clothes made of animal skins and coarse fabric. Long hair, a beard, a wild look. But his eyes, there was no threat or madness in them. There was calmness and absolute concentration. He did not look at Lena or Andrei. He looked at Kostya. Without saying a word, he approached and knelt down next to the wounded man. His movements were precise and economical. He carefully touched the skin around the wound. His fingers, calloused and rough, moved with incredible delicacy. High temperature. Pulses weak. His voice was hoarse, as if he hadn't spoken in years. Tissue necrosis is beginning. Lena and Andrei looked at each other in horror. They didn't understand half the words, but the meaning was clear. "Who are you?" Lena whispered. The man looked up at her, just for a second. "It doesn't matter. If nothing is done, he'll be dead by morning. He needs surgery, right now." Andrei looked at the stranger with distrust. "What kind of surgery? Here? How are you going to do it?" In response, the man silently pulled a long hunting knife from his belt. The blade glinted dully in the light of the fire. Andrei instinctively took a step back. "Are you crazy?" he blurted out. But Lena wasn't looking at the knife. She was looking at the stranger's hands, at how confidently he held it. There was no aggression in his posture, only business. "What needs to be done?" she asked, her voice trembling but firm. The stranger nodded, as if he had been waiting for that question. "Fire. A strong one. I need boiling water. Lots of boiling water. And all the clean cloth you have, and alcohol, or vodka. Anything strong." Andrei hesitated, but Kostya's desperate situation and Lena's determination made him obey. They sprang into action. They stoked the fire and put all the pots of water on it. Lena took the last bottle of medical alcohol and some clean bandages out of the first aid kit. Meanwhile, the stranger prepared his instruments. He cleaned his knife with sand until it shone, then dipped it into a pot of boiling water. From a small leather pouch, he took out a homemade needle made from sharpened bone and a spool of thin but strong fishing line. He did all this silently, with such concentration that it was as if no one else was around. It was as if he was not in the taiga by the fire, but in a sterile operating room. operation began. Sergei worked by the light of the fire and a flashlight held by Lena. Her hands were shaking, but she forced herself to watch. He asked Andrei to hold Kostya firmly by the shoulders. The first movement of the knife was quick and precise. Kostya screamed through his delirium. Andrei turned away, unable to watch. Sergei paid no attention. He was in his own world, a world of anatomy, tissue, and blood vessels. His hands, accustomed to axes and guns, remembered their former magic. He widened the wound, removing dead tissue, fragments of dirt and bark. His fingers found and squeezed the bleeding vessels with astonishing precision. He was working with the same knife he had used to cut up game the day before. He used fishing line instead of surgical thread. It was wild. It was impossible. But it was happening. Lena watched, holding her breath. She didn't see a wild hermit. She saw a genius at work. At one point, a pair of yellow eyes flashed from the darkness behind the trees. Lena shuddered. Sergei raised his head for a moment and said quietly, without turning around, "Asha, get back." The eyes disappeared. He returned to his work, setting the bone. The click he heard was the right one. The bone was back in place. Now all that remained was to stitch up the wound. The work was done. The wound was cleaned, treated with alcohol, and neatly stitched with rough but even stitches. Sergei applied a tight bandage made of clean cloth. He got up from his knees. His face was wet with sweat in the light of the fire. He was breathing heavily. Kostya lay quietly. His breathing became more even, and the fever began to subside. Sergei went to the river and washed his hands for a long time, scrubbing the blood off them. Then he returned to the fire. "The fever will break by morning," he said in a hoarse voice. "In a couple of days, he'll be better. But he needs to go to the hospital. He needs antibiotics. Otherwise, it will all have been for nothing." He looked at Lena and Andrei. "As soon as you can, get out of here. Call for help." He turned to leave. His mission was accomplished. He had broken the main rule, and now he had to disappear into the taiga again. "Wait!" Lena shouted. Her voice was full of despair and gratitude. "Who are you? How can we find you? How can we thank you?" Sergei froze with his back to them. For a moment, his shoulders tensed. He wanted to say something, but remained silent. 10 years of silence had taken their toll. He took a step and simply disappeared into the darkness of the night. Lena and Andrei were left alone by the fire. Their rescued friend lay next to them. The same question echoed in their heads, a question to which there was no answer. Who was this man? 2 days passed in a fog of fear and hope. Lena and Andrei took turns caring for Kostya. They followed the instructions of their mysterious savior, washing the wound with boiled water and changing the bandages. And then a miracle happened. The fever completely subsided. Kostya came to. He was weak, but his gaze was clear. The pain dulled. The stranger was right. He had given them time. On the 3rd day, sorting through the surviving belongings, Andrei found something he had given up hope of ever seeing again. In a waterproof case, tucked into the corner of a backpack, lay a personal emergency beacon. It had miraculously survived. Andrei, not believing his eyes, pressed the button. A red light flashed, sending a distress signal into the indifferent Siberian sky. Now all they could do was wait and hope that someone would hear them. They sat by the fire and talked only about him, about the man from the forest. Andrei was sure that he was some kind of escaped convict, possibly insane, who happened to have medical knowledge. But Lena shook her head fiercely. She replayed his every movement over and over again in her mind. That cold precision, that absolute confidence. That's not how crazy people act. That's how geniuses act. The Ministry of Emergency Situations helicopter arrived 8 hours later. Its roar shattered the centuries-old silence of the Taiga. The rescuers who descended on a rope acted quickly and professionally. But when the paramedic examined Kostya's leg, he froze. He untied the makeshift bandage and saw neat, rough stitches made from fishing line, a clean wound, and a properly set bone. He looked up at Lena and Andre. "Who did this?" His voice was full of bewilderment. "There's a man living here, in the forest," Lena replied. The paramedic shook his head. "This isn't just a person. This is the work of a surgeon sent from God." A veritable pilgrimage began at the district hospital in Verkhneinsk, where Kostya was taken. Doctors from different departments came to look at his leg. The chief physician, an elderly and experienced surgeon named Ivanov, personally removed the stitches. He clicked his tongue as he examined the healing wound. "Look," he said to the young interns. "No signs of infection. The bone fragments are perfectly aligned. The stitching is barbaric, of course, but from a functional standpoint, it's flawless. It was done in completely unsanitary conditions, with a knife and fishing line. I wouldn't guarantee such a result even in a sterile operating room." The news about the Taiga surgeon who saved the tourist spread instantly throughout the city. A local TV channel filmed a story about it. And then the story made it into the federal news. Igor Matveyevich Sokolov sat in a cheap hotel in Verkhneinsk, surrounded by old maps. He smoked one cigarette after another and stared out the window. The news was on TV. The announcer spoke cheerfully about the miraculous rescue of the Moscow students. Sokolov wasn't listening, lost in his thoughts. But then the announcer said, "The operation was performed by an unknown hermit, whom doctors have already nicknamed the Taiga surgeon for his incredible skill." Sokolov spun around to face the screen. He jumped up and moved close to the TV. The screen showed an interview with Chief Physician Ivanov. He described the details of the operation with admiration. Sokolov listened, his face turning to stone. He recognized the style. He had read about it in forensic reports 10 years ago. It was a special, rare surgical knot that Orlov used, his trademark. "I found it," Sokolov whispered. He grabbed his phone. The old numbers were still in his notebook. 15 minutes later, he was talking to Ivanov, introducing himself as an employee of the investigative committee using an old, long-expired ID. He found out the exact coordinates of the place where the rescuers had picked up the group. His long hunt finally had a real goal. At the same time, Yegor Belsky was watching the news in his office. When he saw the footage from the hospital and heard the doctor's enthusiasm, his face contorted. It wasn't admiration, it was rage. So that's where he was, hiding in the woods, playing the noble savior. The man who took his father's life was now giving it to others. The thought was unbearable to him. He dialed Sokolov's number. "Igor Matveyevich." His voice rang with suppressed anger. "Did you see that circus on TV?" "I did," the detective replied calmly. "I already know where it happened." "I don't care how much it costs," Belsky growled. "A helicopter, an all-terrain vehicle, guides whatever. I want you to bring him here. I want to look him in the eyes. Do you understand me?" There was silence on the line. Sokolov realized that his client was losing control, that this chase was turning from a private investigation into a personal vendetta. "I understand you," he replied slowly and hung up. Now it was a race against time and against his client's madness. Sergei Orlov couldn't settle down. He returned to his hut, to his world of silence and order. But something was broken. The silence no longer brought peace. It was oppressive. He sat on the threshold, holding his hunting knife in his hands. The very same one. He looked at his palms, which had become rough from 10 years of axe and oar work. But for a few hours, they had become the hands of a surgeon again. And that memory burned inside him. He had saved a life, and that simple act had destroyed the wall he had built around himself over the past 10 years. He felt like a doctor again, and a doctor cannot hide in the woods when there are people out there who need help. He knew he had made a mistake. Now they knew about him. Sooner or later, they would come looking for him. He had to leave. Right now. Pack a bag, burn the hut, and go hundreds of kilometers deep into the wilderness, where no one would ever find him. He had already started gathering supplies, but his movements were slow and uncertain. Asya lay at his feet, her head resting on her paws, her intelligent eyes fixed on him. The lynx sensed his confusion. He was no longer just a fugitive. He was Sergei Orlov again, and he wasn't sure he wanted to lose him again. In the hospital, Kostya was slowly recovering. Every day he asked Lena to tell him about their savior. "He saved my life, Len," he said, looking at his bandaged leg. "We can't just leave it at that. We have to find him, at least to say thank you." This thought also haunted Lena. She felt indebted to this mysterious man. She spoke to Dr. Ivanov again and again. He told her that, judging by his technique, this man was most likely a vascular surgeon, one of the best. Lena started searching the internet. Missing surgeons, high-profile cases involving medical malpractice. And after a few days, she stumbled upon a story from 10 years ago. The story of a brilliant surgeon, Sergei Orlov, who disappeared after the death of an influential patient. The official version was suicide. The body was never found. The photos showed a young, confident man. But his eyes... Lena recognized those eyes. She had seen them above Kostya's wound in the light of the campfire. She realized that he was not a criminal. He was a victim of circumstances. And she made a decision. She didn't know exactly what she was going to do, but she knew she had to go back there. She had to warn him. Two people, driven by completely different motives, began their journey to the same point on the map. Igor Matveyevich Sokolov, having received an unlimited budget from Belsky, hired the best local guide in Verkhneinsk, a sullen evenk named Stepan, who knew this taiga like the back of his hand. "It's a remote place," Stepan said, studying the map. "Bare trails, but you can get there in 3 or 4 days." Sokolov nodded. He didn't have time for helicopters, which would make too much noise. He wanted to approach quietly. At the same time, Lena Petrova got off a bus in a small village 100 kilometers from the scene. She had a backpack, a map, and a desperate determination in her eyes. She knew she was being reckless. But the thought that the brilliant doctor who had saved her boyfriend would be caught by a ruthless avenger was unbearable to her. She approached some local hunters and asked them about the trails leading to Kamenka. They looked at her with surprise, but one of them agreed to give her a ride in an old truck to the start of an abandoned logging road. The hunt was on. The detective was following the trail to enforce the law and close an old case. The girl was following the same trail to save a man from that law. And in the center of this web, in his hut, Sergei Orlov still couldn't decide whether to run or stay. He didn't know that his solitude had already been broken, and that an inexorable fate in the form of two completely different people was already breathing down his neck. The taiga does not like haste. Igor Matveyevich Sokolov understood this on the very first day. Every step required attention. Snake-like roots clung to his feet, moss hid treacherous pits. His guide, Stepan, moved almost silently, his figure blending in with the trees. He didn't speak, only occasionally pointing to something with his hand. A broken branch, an old bear track. Sokolov followed him, gasping for breath. He had long since taken off his city jacket and tied it to his backpack. He felt old and out of place in this pristine world. He chose a good place to die, Sokolov croaked, stopping to catch his breath. Stepan turned around. His face was unreadable, like the bark of an old cedar tree. "You don't die here. You live here," he replied simply and continued on his way. That phrase stuck with Sokolov. To live, not to hide, not to survive, but to live. It changed everything. A man who had lived here for 10 years couldn't be broken and frightened. He had to become part of this world, and that made him even more dangerous. Or completely different. Lena Petrova was moving much more slowly. The map was only of limited assistance. The logging road where the hunter had dropped her off turned into a barely visible trail after a couple of kilometers, and then disappeared into the forest altogether. She pressed on, navigating by the sun and her compass. Branches whipped her face, and her backpack seemed impossible to carry. She wasn't prepared for this. Group hiking trips along marked trails had nothing in common with this wild, primitive forest. Every crack of a twig made her flinch. She thought about him, about the man who had walked here alone, who had made this hostile world his home. The thought gave her strength. She imagined his face, focused, calm, and she kept going. On the second day of her journey, she made a mistake. Descending a steep, moss-covered slope, she lost her footing. Her leg twisted, and a sharp pain shot through her ankle. She fell, crying out. Her ankle began to swell rapidly. Lena bit her lip to keep from crying. She was alone, in the middle of the endless taiga, with an injured leg. In his hut, Sergei Orlov noticed a change. Not in the forest, but in Asa. The lynx had become restless. She stopped going out hunting for long periods of time. She would sit for hours on the roof of the hut or on a thick cedar branch, staring at a single point in the east. Her ears were constantly moving, picking up sounds inaudible to human ears. Sometimes she made a low, guttural growl. Sergei knew that sound. It wasn't a threatening roar. It was a warning. Someone was coming. He looked at the bag of supplies he had gathered. His instincts screamed, "Run! Hide! Disappear!" For 10 years, that instinct had saved his life. But now something inside him resisted. He looked at his hands. They still remembered the feel of the scalpel, even if it was just a hunting knife. He remembered Lena's face, full of gratitude and trust. He was tired of running. He slowly approached the bag and unpacked it, arranging the supplies on the shelves. Then he picked up the axe. His movements were calm and methodical. He began to chop wood, lots of wood. If guests were coming, he would have to meet them, not as a fugitive, but as the master of this house. "He's here," said Stepan. They stood at the edge of a small clearing. Sokolov saw nothing but grass and trees. "How do you know?" he asked. Stepan pointed to a young pine tree. A notch. Very old. But they renew it once a year so it doesn't get covered with bark. It's a mark. Hunters don't do that. Too inconspicuous. He walked a little further and pointed to a barely visible loop of fishing line above the path. A snare for a hazel grouse. Simple but effective. Your man doesn't just live, he thinks. Every step he takes is calculated. Sokolov felt a rush of professional excitement mixed with something else. With respect. He imagined Orlov, a brilliant surgeon from the capital, learning how to set these snares, mark trees, and read tracks. 10 years of study at the world's most rigorous university in the Taiga. Does he know we're coming? Sokolov asked. Stepan shrugged. He doesn't, but his animal might know, if he has an animal. Sokolov remembered Lena's words about the lynx. So he does have an animal, and that animal is now watching them from the thicket. Lena bandaged her leg with an elastic bandage, leaning on a stick, and walked on. Every step was accompanied by a dull pain. Her speed slowed to half. She realized that she was losing this race, whoever the other participant was. Panic began to give way to cold determination. She had to get there. She simply had to. By evening, when her strength was almost gone, she made it to a small rocky ridge. From here she could see for many kilometers around. And she saw it. A thin, barely visible wisp of smoke rising above the green sea of forest a few kilometers away. Smoke from a chimney, a dwelling. It could only be him. Her heart beat faster. He was there. He hadn't left yet. She had found him. But at that moment, she felt dizzy. Her leg was burning. She looked down. The distance that a healthy person would cover in an hour was now insurmountable for her. She could see her goal, but she couldn't reach it. And she didn't know that on the other side, much closer to the smoke, 2 men were already preparing for their final throw. Sokolov and Stepan lay down on top of a hill covered with thick bushes. From here, the hut was clearly visible. A sturdy log cabin, a roof covered with turf, a neat pile of firewood, and smoke coming from the chimney. Everything was peaceful. Too peaceful. Where is he? Sokolov whispered into his binoculars. And then he saw her. A lynx was sitting on the roof, large and graceful. She was looking straight at them. Sokolov felt a chill run down his spine. She could see them. She definitely could see them. She'll warn him, he said to Stepan. She already has, the guide replied calmly. At that moment, the door of the hut opened. Sergei Orlov stepped out onto the threshold. He was exactly as the tourists had described him. Thin, weather-beaten, with long hair. He wasn't hiding. He didn't look scared. He brought an old hunting rifle to the doorway and leaned it against the wall. Then he sat down on the step and waited. He stared straight at the hill where they were hiding. He knew they were there. He wasn't going to run. He was ready to fight. Sokolov lowered his binoculars. The 10-year chase was over. But the real game was just beginning, and he wasn't at all sure of the rules. Sokolov slowly got to his feet. Stepan looked at him with a silent question. "Stay here," said the detective. "This is my conversation." He did not draw his weapon. He simply straightened his rumpled jacket, as if he were about to enter an investigation office rather than a taiga hut. He began to descend the hill, openly, without hiding. He felt 2 eyes on him, those of the man on the threshold and those of the beast on the roof. Each step through the tall grass seemed deafeningly loud in the ringing silence. Sergei Orlov did not move. He just watched as a short, stooped man in city clothes approached his house. He saw the fatigue in the man's gait. He saw that he posed no immediate threat. But he also knew that this man was the most dangerous of all those who could find him. Because he had not come to kill. He had come for his past. When Sokolov was 20 paces away, he stopped. "Sergei Vladimirovich Orlov?" His voice sounded calm, almost matter-of-fact. Sergei did not answer. He stared silently at his visitor. "My name is Igor Matveyevich Sokolov. 10 years ago, I was in charge of your case." Silence hung between them, heavy and thick. Asha on the roof silently rose to her paws, her body tense like a coiled spring. Sergei slowly shifted his gaze from the detective to his dog and back again. I know who you are, he finally said. His voice was as hoarse and deep as it had been that night by the fire. I've been waiting for you. Sokolov was surprised. He had expected anything. Denial, aggression, an attempt to flee. But not this calm, almost fatal acceptance. Then you know why I'm here, the detective continued, taking another step forward. You came to arrest a man who died 10 years ago. Sergei smiled without a hint of amusement. A little late, don't you think? I came to talk to the man who recently performed a unique operation with a hunting knife and saved a young man's life, Sokolov replied. That surgeon, Orlov, may not be here, but you are, and I have a lot of questions for you. Sergei nodded slowly. Come in, he said, stepping back from the doorway. Since you've come all this way, it would be rude to talk on the street. He turned and entered the hut, leaving the door open. Sokolov froze for a moment. This was not an arrest. It was an invitation. He glanced at the roof. The lynx was still watching him, unblinking. The detective stepped over the threshold into the lair of the man who had been the focus of a third of his career. At that very moment, on the rocky ridge, Lena came to her senses after the pain subsided. She realized she couldn't go on, but she couldn't give up either. She looked at the wisp of smoke. She had to warn him. She took a small signal mirror out of her backpack. It was a faint hope, almost madness. But there were no other options. She caught a ray of sunlight and began to send short flashes toward the hut. 1, 2, 3, pause. 1, 2, 3. An SOS signal. She didn't know if he would see it. She didn't know if he would understand, but she had to try. On the hill, Stepan, who hadn't taken his eyes off the clearing, noticed the flickering. He didn't understand what it was. Just a strange glare. But he was alert. There were no random flashes in the taiga. His gaze began to search the surroundings for the source. He was a good guide, not because he knew the trails, but because he noticed details that others missed. And he didn't like this detail very much. Inside the hut, it was clean and austere. Bunk beds, a table, a stove. Nothing superfluous. Sergei poured herbal tea into 2 iron mugs. He handed one to Sokolov. The detective took it. Their fingers almost touched. Tell me, said Sokolov, taking a sip. The drink was bitter and tart. What do you want to hear? Asked Sergei. The story of how I escaped, or the story of why I did it? First, tell me about your patient. Belsky Sr., Sokolov said bluntly. Did you know he was going to die? Sergei put the mug on the table. His gaze hardened. No. The operation went according to plan. I removed the aneurysm. He should have lived. But after the operation, he started bleeding internally. I was sure it was DVS syndrome, a rare complication. I started following protocol. But everything I did only made his condition worse. He died in my arms. What was it, really? Sokolov asked quietly. Sergei looked up at him. There was pain in his eyes that even 10 years in the taiga couldn't erase. I only realized it a few days later, when I went over everything in my head again and again. It wasn't a complication. He was helped to die. Someone gave him an overdose of anticoagulant in the intensive care unit. Someone who knew that, given the operation, it would cause uncontrollable bleeding, which would be blamed on medical malpractice. Sokolov froze. This version had never been considered by the investigation. Who? Was all he could ask. Who benefited most from his death? Sergei replied with a question. Who got his empire? His son, Yegor Belsky. He was in the hospital that day. He threatened me even before his father died. He said I'd pay if anything went wrong. I think he just sped up the process. And I became the perfect scapegoat, a brilliant surgeon who made a fatal mistake. It was easy to believe. No one would believe that a young heir killed his own father. I had no proof, only guesses. And I knew that Yegor would destroy me, not through the courts, just quietly. That's why I ran away. Sokolov was silent, digesting what he had heard. It was monstrous. But it explained everything. And Orlov's panicked escape, and the obsession with which Yegor Belsky was now searching for him. He didn't want revenge. He wanted to silence the only witness. At that moment, a piercing, furious roar sounded outside. Asya. Sokolov and Sergei turned toward the door at the same time. They rushed to the doorway. Asya was standing in the middle of the clearing, arching her back and baring her teeth. The fur on her neck was standing on end. She growled, staring at the edge of the forest. And from there, from behind the trees, Lena emerged. She was limping, leaning on a stick. Her face was contorted with pain and exhaustion. Seeing the lynx, she froze in terror. "Asya, stay there!" Sergei shouted loudly. The lynx reluctantly obeyed, but did not stop growling, keeping its eyes fixed on the stranger. Sergei and Sokolov rushed toward the girl. "What are you doing here? Are you hurt?" Sergei asked, his medical instincts taking over again. He immediately knelt down to examine her swollen ankle. I came to warn you," Lena gasped, looking from Sergei to Sokolov. "I found out everything. About you. About that case. You're being hunted. The son of that businessman hired him. Belsky." She didn't have time to finish. A scream rang out from the hill where Stepan was standing. Then there was the sound of a gunshot, echoing through the taiga. Sokolov and Sergei looked up sharply. They realized that their conversation had been just a prelude, and that they weren't the only players in this game. The real danger was still out there in the forest. Sokolov and Sergei acted as one. The detective instantly grabbed his old Makarov pistol. Sergei, on the contrary, pushed all thoughts of weapons aside and grabbed Lena, dragging her behind the trunk of a thick cedar tree. His medical mind had already assessed her condition. Shock, trauma, but not fatal. The main threat was not here. "Stepan!" Sokolov shouted toward the hill. But there was no answer. Instead, two figures appeared at the edge of the forest, where Asya had just been growling. One was Stepan. His hands were tied behind his back. The second man, who was roughly pushing the guide forward, was dressed in expensive camouflage clothing. In his hand was a modern pistol with a silencer. Yegor Belsky, his well-groomed, self-assured face, was contorted with triumphant malice. He didn't wait for Sokolov to finish the job for him. He had come to collect his trophy in person. "Igor Matveyevich, I knew you couldn't be trusted." Belsky's voice was calm, but it vibrated with steel. "You're too sentimental for this job." He pushed Stepan out into the clearing and pointed his pistol at Sergei, who had come out from behind a tree, shielding Lena with his body. Asya, the lynx, didn't run away. She took a few steps back and hid in the tall grass, turning into an invisible shadow. Only the tips of her ears trembled above the grass. She waited for a command or a moment. "Well, hello, Orlov," said Yegor, savoring every word. 10 years. You've done well for yourself. Decided to play forest doctor?" "Your father should have lived, Yegor," Sergei replied calmly. His gaze was direct and heavy. "But you couldn't wait. You needed his empire." Belsky's face twitched. His mask of calm cracked. "My father was weak. And you were just a tool, an inconvenient witness who had to disappear, and you almost succeeded. But now it's all over." He's the murderer, Lena shouted from behind Sergei. This man saved my boyfriend. He's a hero. Yegor laughed. A cold, unpleasant laugh. A hero? This butcher? Girl, you don't understand anything. He looked at Sokolov. Drop the gun, Matveyich. Don't make this difficult. I'll pay you double. We'll just say you found him dead. An accident while hunting. Sokolov didn't lower his weapon. He slowly shook his head. No, Belsky, this is my business now. And you're under arrest for kidnapping and suspicion of murder 10 years ago. It was a bluff. Sokolov had no warrant and no real authority, but it was his choice. A choice he made the moment Sergei told him the truth. Yegor laughed again. Arrested? Here? Who will be the witness? The bears? He raised his gun, aiming at Sergei's chest. Enough talk. Time slowed down. Lena screamed. Sokolov began to squeeze the trigger, realizing he was too late. Sergei instinctively pushed Lena to the ground. And at that moment, a blurry gray-red flash flew out of the grass. Asya didn't make a sound. She didn't aim for his throat or face. She did what she had done hundreds of times while hunting. She knocked him off his feet. Her 100 kilograms of rage and muscle slammed into Yegor's arm, which was holding the gun. A shot rang out, but the bullet flew into the sky. The surprise and force of the blow knocked Belsky off balance. He flailed his arms desperately, trying to stay on his feet, and took a step back, straight onto the treacherous, moss-covered root of an old tree. His ankle twisted with a dry, disgusting crack. He screamed, but this time from a different kind of pain, sharp and piercing. His body fell backward and rolled down the gentle but rocky slope leading to the stream. Silence reigned in the clearing, broken only by Belsky's moans and Lena's heavy breathing. Asya stood over him, growling softly, ready to pounce again. Asya, come here, Sergei ordered. The lynx reluctantly obeyed, retreating to her master. Sokolov ran up to Yegor. He was lying by the stream, trying to sit up. His trouser leg was torn, and a piece of bone was sticking out of the wound. It was an open fracture. The same injury as Kostya had suffered. A cruel irony of fate, written by the Taiga itself. Sokolov picked up Belsky's pistol and looked at Sergei. Their eyes met. The 10-year chase was over. It ended not with an arrest, but with a choice. And now the choice was Sergei's. Leave his worst enemy here, at the mercy of nature? Or... Sokolov saw Sergei turn without a word and walk toward his hut. He returned a minute later. In his hands was neither an axe nor a rifle. In his hands was the same leather bag with his surgical instruments. He approached the wounded Yegor Belsky, who looked at him with horror and hatred. Sergei knelt down. Hold him, he said to Sokolov, who was already releasing Stepan. It's going to hurt. Several months later. Igor Matveyevich Sokolov sat in his office and put the final signature on the report. The official report stated that during a search operation in the Taiga, businessman Yegor Belsky had been found with serious injuries sustained in an accident. Next to him were the remains of a man believed to be Sergei Orlov, a surgeon who had disappeared 10 years earlier. Identification based on the fragments found was difficult. The case was officially closed. On Sokolov's desk lay an anonymous package from Siberia. Inside was a lynx figurine, skillfully carved from wood. Lena Petrova and Kostya, who was now walking confidently without crutches, were walking in the park. Lena was holding a book about rare plants of Siberia. On one of the pages was a bookmark, a dried flower she had never seen before. She smiled. She knew he was alive, that he was free, far, far away from here, in an even more remote and untouched corner of the Taiga. A man sat in a new hut that still smelled of resin. He was watching the sunset. Next to him, with its head resting on his knees, lay a large lynx. The man was no longer hiding. He was neither a fugitive nor a hermit. He was home, and only the lynx knew who he really was, and who he had become. Was it worth it for Sergei to save Yegor, his worst enemy? Or should he have left him to the mercy of the taiga?